Today here I would like to sort of talk to you about how do we leverage AI for quality and risk management. And in a lot of ways, oh, there we go. Nice little echo. Okay. In a lot of ways, we'll see how this works out. In a lot of ways, the goal of AI is actually not to create complexity. It's actually how do we actually simplify our world. Healthcare, compared to almost every other industry, is perhaps the most complex that's out there. And so what we're really looking for is how is it that we can leverage technology to make our lives simpler? And that really, in some senses, is the goal of AI in health. And today I want to be talking about specifically how do we have AI help us with clinical outcomes, help us with operational efficiency, and really touching on things like risk adjustment, care management, quality management, as well as underwriting. Hopefully this will work. Excellent. But what are the challenges that we are facing, right? And I'm sure many of you who live day to day experience them, but let's sort of take a step back, go up to 10,000, 50,000 feet and sort of take a look at that. And if you think about the core of what we're trying to do, of what healthcare is really trying to do, is trying to understand for each of us, where is our health today? How is that health going to evolve? What's going to go on? How much is that going to cost? Why is that happening? And then most importantly, what can we do about it? So these three sort of core questions sort of drive the entire industry. And when we think about the ecosystem, right, I'm sure all of you are familiar, how many people do we have in terms of the clinicians or nurses there, how the demand is just continuously increasing, right? We talk about the operations, we talk about different forms of reimbursement, some which are, from one perspective, helping align incentives, but from another, creating greater complexity, right? How do we leverage all this data that we're generating and capturing? It's great that we're doing so, but is it actually being put to use to help us live better lives, help us actually deliver better care? And how do we make sure that from an access perspective? And then, as we sort of talking about earlier, and we sort of saw some extraordinary presentations earlier today, it's great, we all talk about this thing called AI. You hear it about in the news every day, but what is it? And funny enough, back there was already someone who used this exact image for AI. It was just like, what is it that is already in our heads in terms of this vision that we have for this? And the way we think about it as well, it kind of has to look like us, right? Because so far, the best machines that we have to do this is humans, right? Humans are the machine that actually take the data and actually are able to deliver care. So when we think about it, this is kind of an image that comes up. How many people have seen sort of the AlphaGo sort of video of the Go challenge that was there in DeepMind? It's actually fascinating. So if you just there's some excerpts you can go on YouTube. It's actually fascinating to watch, especially with the commentary, right? This is where you would have a machine creating, when we have back then, many years ago, Deep Blue and Kasparov was there. But it's interesting to see how things have evolved from that perspective. Has anyone here actually taken a ride in a self-driving car yet? Tesla with autopilot? Okay, fair enough. Okay, I was going to say you guys are going to keep raising your hands continuously. Yeah. Right, but what we're starting to see is hints that this is actually becoming real. All the way back in the 80s, we had a number of people talking about its potential. But now we can see it how it's touching our daily lives. How many people use like Alexa, Alexa, etc., or Google Home? Okay, right? So we can start seeing how more and more it's actually starting to impact our lives, right? Voice recognition, that is a form of AI, right? It's simply how do I actually take this things that we are saying that I'm right now talking, convert that to text for a machine to understand and then actually be able to automatically reply, right? And so what is this? And so in some senses, AI are systems that learn from data, right? Where we are not explicitly having to do so. Now, machine learning happens to be our current approach of how we actually make that real. And how many people here have heard about deep learning? Right, I'm sure somewhere in some newspaper someone talks about it, right? But what is it? And the interesting thing about deep learning, for more than anything else, it actually is a form of machine learning that actually tries to model itself against the way our current understandings of how we as humans actually process information. Basically layers of neurons, and basically depending upon enough activation going to a particular one, spends, you have the activation function and it continues on, right? But what's interesting is if you look at a lot of the work that's there from all the three images that I was showing you earlier, Go, self-driving cars, and otherwise, a lot of this is actually leveraging deep learning, right? And so it's interesting that that which is mimicking the way we work seems to be creating things that are enabling that to take that next leap. But towards a very interesting presentation that was given earlier, what about the reasoning side? What about the knowledge side? How is it that all this crazy stuff starts helping us with respect to knowledge? And so we can start looking at a variety of ways of how AI is used today. Clinical decision support, we start seeing a lot of the work in terms of radiology. How do I get automatic reads of things, right? How do I automatically take handwritten stuff or OCR and automatically start understanding that unstructured text, right? And then understanding and interpreting video. Now, we are at the beginning of this change, just like, I sort of think about it when we started having mechanizing farming or a variety of other things, or mechanizing assembly of things, right? We are just at the beginning of how this new form of compute is actually going to touch our lives. And though we have written in science fiction books and watched TV shows, I'm sure, throughout our lives, how it is potentially that new worlds will be coming into existence. But it is fascinating to see how it is actually becoming a reality. But that doesn't mean that it's all so very simple, that I just magically plug data into a machine, I walk away, and suddenly genius is come out. And healthcare, as I was saying earlier, is perhaps the most complex industry out there. And it's actually quite challenging for AI. I mean, many of you are physicians or nurses, have spent an extraordinary amount of time learning the field. Well, to say the least, we should not expect the machine to become magic, right? We have to understand that there's a big road between where we start and where we're going to go. And really, there's sort of three major areas that happen to be there that are sort of the challenge with respect to AI, especially in healthcare. The first is data, right? And the reality is healthcare, as we were all referring, is actually a very knowledge-driven field. It is our ability to understand from data, to extract knowledge, and therefore apply it. So how do we actually get AI to do that? The second part is transparency. The first, when you're all kids and you're going to say, the first one, why is the sky blue? Why, right? Why is always the first question of everything. So when someone tries to tell you about a particular diagnosis or particular course of treatment, your first question is, why? And if you can't answer that question, why, you're not going to get a lot of buy-in, right? So really being able to provide that transparency, why is just as important as what. Another interesting thing is about packaging. How is it made so that it's easy for us to use and consume? How many people here have a Rabbit wine cork opener? The one that you just go here and you pop it in, or now these days you just press a button, right? So if you actually look at the chart of my consumption of wine, it kind of looks like this, right? It's a huge, step function the minute I got one. And it really sort of showed to me one very, very clear idea, that when you make something simple to use, easy to use, consumption and use becomes dramatically increased, right? So how you package something is equally important. There we go. As equally important as basically what you're doing and how you make it understandable, especially in healthcare, right? And when we think about healthcare, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the ICD-9s and ICD-10s and SNOMED and the complete cacophony of madness that happens to, result in. But the reality is people get care in a variety of places, and you don't get an easy longitudinal record of somebody, right? It's very complex, the dimensionality is very high, all right? And you only get data about people when they're not feeling well, right? Or when they get past a certain, state of not feeling well. And so for those of us on the technology side, when we deal with data, a lot of time is actually just spent cleaning that data up, right? And then with to transparency, I mean, how many of you would use Google Maps without the maps, right? You wouldn't. And what you don't realize is that the interface actually intuitively explains why it is suggesting a particular route. Here's the green path, the other ones look red, that makes sense, right? So, if you're saying, do I take, the 101 or the 10 or the 4 or 5, you go ahead and ask the explanation. That's really where the maps really come in. And then lastly, of course, how easy you make it to use. I just click, I purchase, I press a button someplace, and magically things show up. That's amazing packaging, right? And it's not just about the box, it's actually the entire service, right? So if you really think about these three things, these are the challenges that there are in healthcare. How is it that we do that, especially for AI? How is it we plug that into our workflow in a way that's very easy? How do we make sure it's transparent so we can all understand why? And how do we actually deal with the complexity of the data that's there? So I'll talk to you days about a little bit about Lumiata, but more just as an example of how it is you actually go ahead and do AI in healthcare. And one of the key things or key insights that we had is towards comments that were before, we have this extraordinary amount of knowledge that we have been building for the last 100, 200 millennia about healthcare, about humans. Why can we not leverage that to better AI and combine that with machine learning? And that's really sort of what our focus is how do we actually interpret and extend the data that we have today so that we can actually drive better health outcomes. And we'll talk a little bit about how now we have about 80 million patient records, about 25 million of them have about 3 years worth plus of data mining all of PubMed, spending about 40,000 physician hours, how we've taken these different approaches to combine that to actually build AI that actually works in healthcare. And actually, how is it that you can start evaluating or thinking about AI, and so therefore you can actually test and say, here's how this is actually going to perform in the real world and when and where it's going to be useful. Because really what we're trying to drive is this interesting point of how do you align the mission and the business of healthcare, right? We can all sort of intuitively understand what that mission is. We all day-to-day experience here in the field, the business of healthcare. But really what we're trying to do at the end of the day is how do we create alignment between these two, because that's when we're actually going to be able to drive outcomes that truly matter. So in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do is we try to create better data. A lot of the data that you get or you record actually doesn't contain the knowledge in and of itself of how it is someone has arrived at a conclusion or what is the way to actually interpret a piece of data, right? And so what if you can take that raw data and augment that with the knowledge of a physician, right? Address and apply the rigor of an actuary, right? And in some senses, try to understand the behavioral aspects of people, right? That empathy of a therapist. What if you can inject that within data to deeply enrich that data? What then can you do? Are you then able to actually start applying that which we are start building as AI these days into actually something that delivers value? And so how do we get to an accurate diagnosis? How do we understand for whom should we really be focusing on because there's actually going to be a response from that individual? And how do we make sure it's actually cost functional, right? At the end of the day, things have to make sense, both not only clinically, but also financially. And so what we have really spent is not looking at a particular condition. We haven't just focused on diabetes or congestive heart failure. We haven't just focused on cost. What we tried to fundamentally focus on was how do we do all of it at once? How do we build a thing that can model diabetes and understand how that potentially changes on an individual basis? Congestive heart failure, pancreatic cancer, any of these things. How is it that we can have something truly learned from the data across numerous different conditions, across costs, across behavior, so that we can actually do something meaningful? And the first part is really saying, how do I take this extraordinary spectrum of data? There's claims data, lab data, EHR data, social data, radiological data, right? How do I take this huge, vast amounts of different types of data and combine that so I can get as clear a picture of an individual? Because that's really what you're doing. You're assembling this jigsaw, pieces together so you get the best picture possible, right? And then you want to enrich that because I can show you a partial part of that picture and you usually can probably fill that in because why? From the patterns that you've seen otherwise. So how do you fill those patterns in, right? And that's really the first part. The second part is therefore trying to understand, as many of the clinicians and other people here have seen, what is the pathway, what is the trajectory, how are things changing over time, right? And that's really where we're really putting in the part of the deep learning. But towards this point of transparency, we really said, okay, how is it that we can actually have this make sense? Can we actually explain why someone is potentially diabetic or going to become diabetic? Because that is what gives you the clue to actually address the underlying problem. What are the actual risk drivers for this individual that's causing that change in that person's health so that you can actually intervene in a way that's very targeted and meaningful? And lastly, at the end of the day, we have to prioritize to whom we spend our time, right? So how do I take that deep insight, that deep understanding at an individual level, and really therefore go across hundreds and thousands of millions of people, identify, today, Jane is the most important person, and tomorrow it's going to be, Mark, right? So it's really an issue of how you do that, but do that in a way that is scalable across the different situations because the complexity and diversity of healthcare, as I said, is perhaps the greatest out there. And in a lot of ways, what we try to do is we try to net this down. We try to simplify, right? As I was talking about at the beginning, AI's job is not just to add you more data. That's great, but that is not helpful. What you need to do is you need help to simplify. How do I narrow down? Basically helping you focus on that which matters. So how do you go ahead and take all this extraordinary complex data and net that down so that you can say, today I'm going to focus on Jane because I'm seriously worried about a progression of chronic kidney disease. And the thing that's really driving it is because she's not able to take her meds because of transportation issues, right? So it's really an issue of being able to net that down so that you can become very targeted and understand from a financial perspective, a clinical perspective, and behavioral aspect what's going on in a targeted way. And so in a lot of ways, we've tried to sit there and say, now, how do we actually bring this to life, right? This is a core capability and understanding. And this is what I mean by packaging. This is a part that we're still experimenting on. What is the right form of packaging to be able to take this insight and make that usable, right? And this is the part where we start talking about risk adjustment. We start talking about quality, right? These are processes that we all touch on. So how is it I can take this insights now and say, how do I help you identify the true health status of people and which physician to engage with so that therefore, one, you have identified the true health status of people, two, documented appropriately, and three, make sure that people are getting the right care that they need, right? And this is directly about impacting risk adjustment. So it's very clear that one, from a financial perspective, it makes sense because otherwise you are actually taking on risks that you're otherwise not being reimbursed for, right? Two, you're actually, by doing this, actually delivering better care to people because you're ensuring, one, that they're diagnosed correctly, and two, that they're getting the right course of management, right? That's one sort of way in which you can leverage this core understanding of AI here and use of AI for risk adjustment. But you can flip that around to the issue of quality, right? You can sit there and say, given the behavioral patterns of not only the patient, but also the physicians that are taking care of them, which of those people are more likely to actually fulfill their HEDIS measures versus the ones that are not? So where is it you're going to spend your efforts to actually go ahead and get those measures, or which ones are automatically going to be done because either the patient is very compliant or you have a great set of providers who are really good at managing that population. And then lastly, for things like underwriting is how do I take that understanding of not only the clinical side, but the financial side to make sure that I price things correctly so that as a business, you are going to be efficient and effective, right? So these are example ways that we have touched on taking these deep insights and actually packaging them for very everyday use cases that there are in healthcare that actually I'm sure many of you happen to be involved in. By the way, how many people here are involved in risk adjustment? Fair enough. Just a few. How many people here are in quality measures and the rest? Okay, a few more. Care management? A few more? Fair enough. So, as we go through, and we think about the overall ecosystem of healthcare, so these are a few of the processes that, engage and touch upon every day. Because at the end of the day, when you look at these processes, interestingly enough, they run on lists. So that's the reason why when we talk about one way to sort of package, and I actually was talking with John Ball, who runs Einstein over at Salesforce, if any people are familiar. And we were amazed about the similarities about his world and our world, that at the end of the day, it ends up being people work on lists. And so an extraordinary way for AI to inject itself into our everyday lives in a way that actually is not intrusive, but actually helps us and actually gives us a return is helping us prioritize the list that we're working with. Who do I engage with today? What do I need to do, right? Things of that nature. How do I take and offset and take advantage of these millions of potential variables that are going on with each person? How do I combine them in ways that therefore I can make use of? And so talking about risk adjustment, talk about underwriting, talk about quality and care. And really we do this by this notion of combining knowledge. A lot of people from the machine learning side of the day say, just take the data and shove it in, right? And that works in very different industries where what I would say they have very tall data. They have literally billions of examples of what goes on, and they have maybe a couple hundred variables. So in that particular case, the machine is able to figure things out. Healthcare, and all puns intended, has very fat data, right? It is actually millions of variables and actually only millions of examples, right? It almost looks like a square, right? And so as a result, that same tools that were easily able to be used in other industries don't directly transfer. And so what we have found that when you are able to leverage knowledge, which is basically our distillation of hundreds of millions of people over the course of hundreds of years, you're able to arrive at a better place, right? And then by combining that with the ability to interpretability to address the transparency, and then thinking about packaging in terms of lists. And so this is really what we do, and sort of giving you hopefully a window into one way that folks are applying AI in healthcare in sort of a way that's actually able to address its complexities and transforming that in a way that it's actually usable in today's processes and hopefully starts generating the transformation that we're looking for, right? And we're really thinking about how is it we rethink the data, because in the end it's a very knowledge-based industry. How does we rethink the data with AI, helping us all rethink that data, right? The thing is understanding the fluctuations of someone's lab, combining that with previous conditions, providing that with other factors becomes extremely difficult. And if you have all the time in the world to focus on one person, we can do it. The problem is humans overall and physicians overall don't scale that well. They cannot monitor, one person cannot monitor, or even hundreds of them cannot monitor millions of patients every day, especially with the velocities and volumes of data we are now generating. And so really, how is it we help provide tools for them so that we can really surface the signal from the noise and actually be valuable? And really being able to show the chain of reasoning. And any clinician here would say, well, this is obvious. But what's exciting about this is the fact that we are able to automatically learn this from data, right? Yes, I know if the GFR is lower than 50 or 60, we already know the person has CKD. But one can see here the trends of what's going on and ability for the machine to explain that towards that rationalization of what goes on is actually very important, because therefore we can understand what then to do. And what we've seen by sort of doing this, moving from sort of basic statistical means in terms of regression, we've been able to show a much higher degree of accuracy. And the reason why that's important is that with greater accuracy results in basically better ROI. That when I know with an 80% likelihood that someone has congestive heart failure, then out of 10 people, that means 8 of them people will have it, and therefore my activities that I'm doing actually will return in a net positive, right? And so it's really important that your accuracy be there, right? And then that actually really impacts your bottom line or top line at the end of the day as well. And what you can sort of see here, interestingly enough, from just your basic regression, is that you get this huge boost of accuracy, even when by just enriching that raw data with knowledge. And then you sort of take that next step with deep learning to get even further degrees of accuracy. And so that's what's really exciting. You can sort of see that and prove that. And we can see that on a variety of levels, like in terms of how well can I understand the utilization of folks. So who's actually going to be costing me what and why? And being able to show a greater degree of accuracy. That helps you actually focus your attention and helps you do a better job overall as an organization, right? And then once again, talking about that lift that you have from risk adjustment. And it's sizable from that perspective, right? So when we think about not only looking at AI to be used at the front end of the thing, but we can leverage how do we think of AI in the back office to really create that transformation that really frees up the resources, really helps drive the whole process to actually delivering greater value, right? And so this is an example of about analyzing close to 1 million people, some 967,000 people. And what you're really identifying here is about 27,000 people who have collectively about 44,000 different conditions that are not being engaged on, right? And those are real people. Those are real things that are being missed, right? And so what can we do, right? I mean, one of the things that infuriates me but excites me every day is I see thousands of people to whom you can see that they have a particular condition and nobody's actually managing it. That, of course, is the part that's infuriating. The exciting part is we are now able to determine and identify that, so then we have the opportunity to actually positively impact those people's lives before an acute event. And really, you're able to touch and say, look, there's these 9,000 diabetics, there's these people, 1,600 people with heart arrhythmias, RA, CHF, et cetera, just for example. These are clear conditions that are being missed. And then which of those providers should I be reaching out to inform them so that they can go ahead and engage those patients effectively, right? So this is ways you're transforming all that data into very actionable activities so that you're actually touching people's lives. Right? At the end of the day, we're trying to leverage AI to tell what is the patient story, right? So that we can actually go ahead and make it a better story. And there's different ways to visualize that and sort of give that chain of reasoning in a way to understand that. But this is, as we talked about FHIR and Smart on FHIR earlier today, there are different ways that people are enabling us to directly integrate all the way to the point of care, and that's also exciting. So as we think about the opportunity for AI in healthcare, it really enables us to span the spectrum all the way from the back office to the front office, allowing us to really transform the data and combine it with the knowledge that we have to really address the challenges that are there with the data, transparency, and packaging, right? And hopefully, today was giving you a little bit of a window into just thinking about how it is that AI can actually be applied here in healthcare. How do you do so with rigor? How do you do so in a way that allows you to understand what's going on and provide you hopefully a frame to think through how AI may touch what you do and ways in which it can help you do what you need to do, right? And this is just driving into some of the details on things like risk adjustment and understanding that it's not just about the patient, it's also about the provider. Which provider is the best provider for this individual to go and engage with for a particular condition, right? You got to look at the overall ecosystem, right? And you go ahead from a risk adjustment perspective, you can clearly see some deltas from a financial perspective, right? And when we think about it overall, it's not just about the individual, but am I dealing with an organization? Am I dealing with an employer? How is it I deliver better value to them? How can I deliver the right, more targeted benefits for those employees so that actually both sides win at the end of the day, right? And really enabling that quality and care that you're talking about so that you can take and segment appropriately and drive it through your disease management programs or your chronic care programs that you have. And really sort of understanding that overall flow. So I think I have still a couple minutes here, but wanted to make sure we had time for questions, comments, etc. So please.